Okay, everyone, welcome to this month's Making Mitigation Work webinar series. My name is Lori Peak, and I am the director of the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado Boulder. And it's my honor and pleasure to welcome you to this month's webinar, which is made possible with the support of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, as well as the National Science Foundation, and every member of the Natural Hazard Center team that contributes so mightily to pulling this series off each month. So welcome, we're so glad you're here. If you haven't already, please do go ahead and put your name and where you are joining from in the chat box. We're excited to welcome people from across the US, the territories, our tribal regions, and also from other countries around the world. Before we go any further today, we did want to note that today's forum is being recorded, and we will post the captioned recording as well as the different slide decks from today's presentation up on our website at hazards.colorado.edu under our trainings tab. And also, this is where you can access past event recordings from this series. If you do have questions or comments that you want to raise throughout the webinar today, please do go ahead and put them in either the chat or the Q&A box. Please know that we bounce between both of them and we monitor both, and we will get to as many questions and comments as we can. For those we don't get to, we'll provide written feedback to you after the webinar is complete. And we will go through the 3 presentations today, and then any remaining time will be reserved for questions and comments. Also, for those of you who are here and are working toward your emergency management certification, we are very thankful for an ongoing partnership with the International Association of Emergency Managers, which allows you to earn 1 contact hour toward your emergency management training certification. So the only requirement is that you stay here for the duration of the webinar and that you attend live. And then after, you can reach out to the one and only Katie Murphy here at the Natural Hazard Center at hazctr@colorado.edu. She'll drop that email as well as the link to our continuing education webpage into the chat. And you can reach out to Katie to ensure that you receive your certificate for attending today's webinar. So thank you for being here. So today's webinar is focused on equitable engagement with underserved communities, an update on state and local mitigation planning guidance and research. And this is actually for the dozens and dozens of these webinars that we've held over the last couple of years in partnership with FEMA. This is actually the first one where FEMA and the Natural Hazard Center teams are actually decided to co-present. And so we sort of came to think of this presentation as sort of a play in 3 parts, if you might. And so first and foremost, we are going to hear from Kathleen Carlisle at the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And she is going to be sharing some really important key updates that have recently been made to FEMA's planning guidance. And so Kathleen's going to lead us off with about a 15-minute overview of those updates, what they're all about, why they matter, and importantly, when those updates need to be done. And so what's the action associated with these updates? So Kathleen's going to lead us off. And then what we thought about as we were reviewing this updated planning guidance is that the Natural Hazard Center has been developing a series of tools as well as applied research studies that we hoped could be of use as states and territories and tribes are moving forward with updating their mitigation plans. And so next, that's going to bring us to Act 2, where we're going to hear a brief presentation from Carson McPherson-Kretzky, where she is going to share some of the tools and resources that the Natural Hazard Center has been creating in partnership with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, focused specifically on risk communication and socially vulnerable populations. And then we're going to close out with another brief presentation from Mary Painter, Melissa Villarreal, and myself, focused on some research related to state hazard mitigation plans and their emphasis on social vulnerability and socially vulnerable populations. And so without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can turn this over to Kathleen. And again, we hope that everybody will put your comments, questions in the chat as we are moving forward, because we'll move through the 3 presentation sets and then we'll save time for Q&A. So Kathleen, thank you for being here. Thank you for taking this on behalf of your entire team, and turning the mic over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me and see the slides?
Yes, everything looks perfect.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Lori and the Natural Hazard Center. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk about the mitigation planning policies, especially in the context of equity. So good day, everyone. I'm just going to give you kind of an overview today of the updates, especially where equity is concerned. We'll start with sharing a few facts about the mitigation planning program for those of you who may not be as familiar with it. I think many are on this call, but just a few fact updates. Also, as I mentioned earlier, really the focus is key updates to the state. We'll focus on the state. So really talking about state today, but also a little bit about the local planning policy guides that call on states to consider equity throughout the planning process. And then we'll share some resources and materials that we have, best practices trainings. There's always a lot to explore and find on our website and some other places to get you going with learning about equity and mitigation planning. So we have this slide, we've used it in a few presentations. It's our mountain climber analogy. And for those of you that play golf, maybe this is a really tough par 4. So really we want you to think about the mountain climber as decision-making and having the planning, the mitigation plan and that planning process shaping those priorities all along the way to resilience. And I don't know that resilience is ever 100% achieved. I think we're always working on it, but really we want to certainly get a lot more resilient, especially as we're seeing all the impacts from climate change. So that really entails scoping out a good planning grant. If you're intending to get a planning grant, many local communities do get grants for mitigation planning and states. So that scope is really important. And then the planning process and the mitigation plan is complete and stays updated. And then you're scoping projects and you're scoping activities and then making those investments that will get you to that resilient place. So we just we tried to figure out how to make this a picture, a visual. Just a few planning status facts. This data was just updated. And for really, since about 2004, all 50 states have had and have maintained their mitigation plans. Also the District of Columbia and the 5 US territories. And we now have more than 25,535 local governments that have mitigation plans, and 246 tribal governments out of 574 federally recognized tribes. So approximately with this coverage, it's about 84%. We can say 84% of local communities in the US are covered by a hazard mitigation plan. The policies that we'll talk about today briefly. There's the State Mitigation Planning Policy Guide, kind of a new name. We call this the State Mitigation Plan Review Guide before, and the Local Mitigation Planning Policy Guide. We're required to update these every 4 years. I can confess we don't always stick to the schedule. The last time we released the local policy guide was in 2011, and the last time we released the state guide was in 2015. So these are, and Coincidentally, tomorrow is the day that these policies become effective. They were released on April 19th of last year, and we usually offer 1 year. We like to give the states and the locals a year to get used to these policies. We know it's not an easy transition. Folks are already working on their plans, and so the regional planners have been working very closely with the states and the local governments to try to make sure we get through this transition period. And in accordance with the regulations, they're kind of broken up like this. There's a section on responsibilities that corresponds with 201-44 CFR 201.3. The standard state requirements are in 44 CFR 201.4, and in 201.5 are the enhanced state requirements. So you see those corresponding sections in the state guide and similar in the local. And there are also some procedural guidance that's included, including, for instance, in the state guide, how to submit for an enhanced plan, how to go through that process and get prepared for an enhanced plan submission. And states that have enhanced plans are eligible for 5% additional HMGP hazard mitigation grant program funding, which is disaster-related funding. And tribes have a separate policy, and that was last released in 2017, and we will begin this year, this summer. We're planning tribal listening sessions, consultation. It's a little longer process because with tribes, we'll go through a consultation process, and that's all in accordance with FEMA tribal consultation policy. So hopefully in a couple of years or so, we'll have an updated tribal policy. Now, there are several grant programs that for which a mitigation plan is required. And so we're just listing them here. Well, I won't go into all of these programs in detail, but BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, Flood Mitigation Assistance. These are non-disaster, I call them non-disaster. It's not required to have a disaster to apply for these programs. Congress has appropriated some funds and they're available. There's an application period and a NOFO and those kinds of things. The HMGP, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and post-fire and public assistance, and the fire management grants, FMAG, those are all related to a disaster. So if there's a declared disaster or fire, then those programs become available based on the cost of the disaster. And usually funding can't be obligated until the mitigation plan is in place. And for instance, public assistance, C through G, that's really for states. It's not a requirement for local, but all of this is in the guide, and also in the recently, you'll find a lot of information about mitigation grants in the recently released HMA guidance. So there's so much going on, and there are a couple new ones. There's a revolving loan fund from the Storm Act. There's a web page. FEMA has a web page and a lot of guidance there. It's also as part of their HMA. You find that in their HMA guidance web pages. And rehabilitation of high hazard potential dams, which is for states, that is, if the state addresses those special requirements, they're in a special section, then they can be eligible for HHPD funding. And so again, I wish I had more time to go through all of that, but there are lots of resources available. So we really wanted to talk about equity in the 2022 policies. And there was FEMA, there were some executive orders that came out in 2021, and FEMA was really, they've really emphasized this and climate change. So there was a lot more emphasis in the updates on climate and equity. And why include equity other than there are executive orders, there's strategic direction at FEMA in this direction, but really we've talked for years about involving the whole community in mitigation, in resilience, in disaster assistance. And if you don't include everyone, you're not including the whole community. So the mitigation planning process is really a a great opportunity to counter systematic barriers to equity. And FEMA defines equity as the consistent and systematic, fair and just impartial treatment of all individuals. So in the state plan, when states analyze their risk, develop their mitigation strategies, they look at kind of two aspects. They look at their state facilities, the things that the state owns and operates, and how that, what is the risk to those assets, and how should that be mitigated, but also looking at the entire state and looking at the local mitigation plans and the risk to the state as a whole, and thinking about jurisdictions and the risk to jurisdictions and setting that direction. So as part of that second piece, especially, certainly would apply to looking at state assets as well, but in the guidance, the updated guide, it's really emphasized in this context of looking at the whole state and the jurisdictions and the risks, and also emphasizing the importance of prioritizing as one of the factors when thinking, because states will make a lot of decisions about how to direct funding and grants, and that thinking about underserved communities and socially vulnerable populations should be a criteria. And we do define in the guidance social vulnerability and underserved communities, social vulnerability being the potential for loss within an individual or group, and recognizing there are characteristics that influence this group's ability to prepare and respond. So that's one aspect. And then historically underserved communities, that's referring to populations sharing a particular characteristic, as well as geographic communities that have been systematically denied the full opportunity to participate in all aspects of civic life, economic and social and civic life. So they're slightly different groups and there's overlap, but really we're using those two definitions and asking that the state consider these criteria when they're looking at their risk and their strategies. So in the planning process, again, it's planning process, risk assessment and strategy. In the planning process, the state is required to describe how they coordinated with agencies within the state that support these communities. That it varies from state to state, but certainly housing, economic development, there are agencies and experts within the state that have the expertise in this area. And it could also be outside of the state. It could be nonprofit groups, but really it's important at the very beginning to bring these experts into the planning process. And for the risk assessment, as I was kind of already describing previously, the state must analyze vulnerability of jurisdictions and the state as a whole, geographic regions, et cetera, and set that direction and really look at the impacts of hazards on populations. And that includes socially vulnerable and underserved communities, as I was describing before in as we've defined that. And also summarize recent and projected development that includes demographic changes. So we always ask states to look at changes in development. What is planned? And as you're planning this, as you're seeing these plans unfold throughout the state, what are the development trends? And how could those impact these communities? We also have, I call this non-regulatory guidance. So the policy guides set the minimum requirements in accordance with the regulations, but we also on our website have some tools that help with approaches and different methods for meeting the requirements and suggestions and data sources, et cetera. We call these the key topics bulletins. There are actually 4. The 3 here, it's our planning process, risk assessment, and mitigation strategy. We also have one on state capabilities. They're a little shorter, they're pretty easy to digest. And really those are aimed at those that are developing plans. The guide really has two audiences, the plan reviewer at FEMA that has to review the plan and make sure it's meeting the requirements, and offering suggestions and technical assistance, et cetera. And also the states and the locals, so they are aware of what the requirements are. And of course, any other interested parties, but kind of multi audiences. So I just have a slide here to talk briefly about local, because really I think that's where the equity principles and planning are implemented at the local level. So in the planning process in the local guide, the communities must describe how the process gave stakeholders that represent socially vulnerable and underserved communities the opportunity to participate, and document how the public and members of underserved communities had a chance to participate. So again, early in that process, bringing these people in so they have a voice, and we're meeting people wherever they are, and we're again involving the whole community. And in the risk assessment, describe the vulnerability of each jurisdiction, and that includes looking at socially vulnerable and underserved communities. And then, of course, the strategies should be reflecting that risk assessment. And in the strategy, again, include actions that benefit these communities and evaluate these actions. You can evaluate these actions using qualitative benefits. So not only monetary benefits, but qualitative benefits, including how they benefit underserved and socially vulnerable communities. So we have a lot of training available, and some of the guidance I already mentioned. Here's some links, and these slides will be available, so you can have access to these easily. The key topics bulletins I mentioned that have been updated for the new guide, and the local mitigation planning handbook, the new handbook will be coming out very soon. So we're really excited, and that will be compatible with the updated local guidance. FEMA has their own equity website with a lot of great information, and mitigation planning has an equity webpage as well. So encourage you to take a look at those. And then we do have training for all of these, the update of these guides. This IS and L329 are for states, and the new state guide and the LK318 are for local. And there's a playlist. I won't go through all of this, but we have some great YouTubes as well. We also have some tools, and for the Q&A session, I'm not an expert on these tools, but we do have some newly released tools and data that states can use and locals can use to look at risk. The National Risk Index, it identifies communities most at risk for 18 natural hazards. It visualizes risk metrics, includes data on annual losses, and incorporates social vulnerability and community resilience data. And this covers geographies ranging from counties to census tracts. So that's kind of a preloaded tool. The second one, resilience analysis and planning tool, wrapped, has multiple data layers, and local data can be incorporated into that tool as well. So that's another tool that you might want to explore. Again, I won't go into detail, but I wanted to make sure you were all aware of it. And then this is a non-FEMA resource, climate and economic justice screening tool. CJEST is the acronym they use. And this is actually the preferred tool of the administration now and of FEMA, identifying disadvantaged communities at the census tract level with nationally consistent data, and then considers communities disadvantaged if they meet certain criteria. And I won't go through all of that in detail. It considers communities disadvantaged if they are located on lands of federally recognized tribes. So they're kind of just automatically included as a disadvantaged community in this tool. So, and criteria used for grant scoring will be used from this CJEST tool. So that's important because FEMA is kind of adopting this as one of their official criteria. And then this is just the shameless plug for other FEMA resources. I really encourage you to take a look at the guides to expanding mitigation. There is one on equity, and there's also one on making the connection to older adults. FEMA partnered with AARP on that guide to expanding mitigation. And there are a number of other topics, the arts, even one on cemeteries. It's quite a series. So agriculture. So really encourage you to take a look at those. Take a look at our website. Of course, there's a great deal of information there. We do have a document called Mitigation Ideas, just to get ideas for projects. I hope we can update that soon. We haven't updated it in a while, and it's a helpful tool. And then, of course, here's a resource to a resource. We actually have a resource list where you can see all of FEMA mitigation planning and mitigation other mitigation resources that might be helpful. That's all I have, Lori.
Kathleen, thank you so much. And as you will see, the chat and the Q&A box are already filling up with gratitude for you and also some questions. People are definitely wanting to follow up on those links for resources, get access to your slides and so forth. And so, Melissa, would you, speaking of slides, would you go ahead and share your screen? And Kathleen, we will definitely loop back to these questions once we get through the next two brief presentations. And Melissa, the slides were in full screen mode, but now we're seeing the notes mode. So if you could please go back to the full screen mode. Perfect. And then Kathleen, thank you again. Now we're going to turn this over to Carson McPherson-Krutsky, who is a research associate here at the Natural Hazard Center, and also again has been working closely with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to develop a series of guidance materials building on the work of Nania Campbell. So really over the past 4 years, this is a culmination of efforts that have been ongoing. And so we had hoped that having some time today for Carson to share these resources could help to pick up on the resources that Kathleen just shared, that our state and local partners and tribal partners could hopefully draw on these as you're updating your plans. So Carson, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori, and happy to be on this panel today. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a 33-year-old woman with fair skin and medium length blonde hair and glasses, and I am wearing a blue sweater today in my home office with some frames behind me. So I'm so happy to share these resources today. Before I do that, I wanted to also provide some definitions and context for this work. So Melissa, can you go to the next slide? And so I think it's important, Kathleen provided some great definitions of underserved communities and social vulnerability, but I think it's helpful to reiterate what we mean when we talk about socially vulnerable populations. And those are the populations that face disproportionate disaster risk due to a variety of social, economic, political, and historical factors. I also want to emphasize that all communities have socially vulnerable groups. Some of those include people over 65, children, unhoused populations, people with disabilities, to name a few. Also, vulnerability is not inherent to a person or community. Instead, it is conditioned by historical and social factors. And so I want to remember that as we're going through these slides. Next. And so for these resources, they're focused on risk communication and social vulnerability. And so traditional classic communication models have really assumed that risk communication will lead to action. But in reality, when we're thinking about these different populations with all these historical, political, and social contexts, risk communication is actually much more complex. And there's a number of barriers that we need to consider when we're thinking about how we communicate or how we engage with these different types of populations. So the Natural Hazard Center partnered with the Army Corps of Engineers over the last 4 years to think about how we translate about 50 years of academic literature on risk communication and social vulnerability into something that practitioners can use, because oftentimes it really stays in the research space and we want this information to be translated into something that other people can use. Next slide. So now I'm going to go into these 3 resources that we've developed that are publicly available, and we can hopefully put the link to them in the slides. You can download them today if you are interested. As Lori mentioned, these were developed by a team of people led by Dr. Nania Campbell over the last couple of years, and then I've taken on this project since then. This set of resources is intended for flood hazard and risk practitioners. However, the information can really be applied in broader contexts. And the goal is to provide evidence-based guidance on how to meaningfully involve socially vulnerable populations in the risk communication process. Next. So now I'm going to go over each of these resources and give a summary of what they are and specific components of each one. So the first resource that was developed is an annotated bibliography. It's 60 pages of really great information that summarizes key publications on risk communication and social vulnerability. And these are coming from both academia and also from national agencies. And then it also organizes this literature around themes and populations of interest to practitioners. Next slide. So here's just an example of how these documents are formatted. So included under each publication is the title of the publication, a key summary of the findings, as well as the abstract, and then importantly, a take-home message from that document. So you can easily swipe through these 60 pages and take away the most important information. So we wanted it to be dense in terms of the information that was there, but also easy to access for people who are busy and really want to get at those key take-home messages. Next slide. The second resource that was developed was a guidebook that provides an at-a-glance resource for practitioners. And this really was the second step and born out of the information that came out in the annotated bibliography. And it defines 3 key principles of risk communication that I'll talk about next that emerged from this literature review. It also importantly provides examples of these principles across the disaster lifecycle, from preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. Next. So these key principles can be used in this risk communication context, but I think they can be used more broadly as well. These principles include communicating through familiar and trusted messengers, providing clear, actionable information, and tailoring messages and information pathways for target audiences. And the guide really dives deep into what each of these principles mean. Next. Included in the guidebook, it goes through each principle one by one, and then it includes underlying concepts and implications, and then as well as tips for applying each principle in practice. And then a really great feature of this guide is Nania and that group pulled together a number of case studies. And so they show what these examples of these principles are in practice in each of the different phases of the disaster life cycle. So you can see how practitioners are putting this information into practice. Next. The third resource that was developed are a series of 5 worksheets that goes even further into breaking down these 3 core principles into simple steps and questions that help guide users in applying these principles in their own context and own work. And so these provide also additional resources and quick tips that you can go to. I believe there's a number of documents that point to FEMA, Army Corps, EPA, other agency documents that are all included here and are really great resources as well. And these worksheets are intended to be used before initiating the risk communication process. And then the 5th worksheet is after implementation of a risk communication project. Next slide. So I wanted to just show you a little bit about what these worksheets look like. So this is from the Principle 1 worksheet, which is focusing on the principle of communicating through familiar and trusted messengers. And so steps included in this worksheet are identifying the organizations and gatekeepers that are largely trusted by target audiences. I think this is really important when we're thinking about how to engage with underserved or socially vulnerable populations. This is really helping provide this guide to thinking about how these people may be wanting to engage with information, who they trust in the community, and having you think about who those people might be that you can work with. The second step is developing a plan to reach out and build relationships with potential risk communication partners that are trusted by target audiences. And then the third is reaching out to potential risk communication partners to discuss your risk communication priorities and collaborate where appropriate. Next slide. And then in these worksheets, it goes into specific questions to help you reflect on how your team or group may approach these. So for example, under step 1, we have what trusted individuals, institutions, or outlets do members of your target population turn to for information and assistance during times of crisis. They really probe you to think deeply about the community that you're working in and how you might approach not only risk communication, but just engagement in general. Next. And so what we've been doing in the last year or two is taking all of these resources that we've developed and then working to do trainings with the Army Corps of Engineers. So we had a training last spring and also in February, and we're conducting one right now where we really take these materials and test them out with folks to get feedback and tell us what they like, how we should improve them, and really make sure that they are helpful for practitioners. And so I just wanted to pull out 2 quotes from people who participated in these trainings and have used these worksheets. So the first one says that the principles of risk communication worksheets are useful because they prompt the user to ask important questions that better address how to identify socially vulnerable groups, how to communicate effectively to those groups, and how to drive action with your communication efforts. Second person said, these materials made me consider why I thought what I thought and if I was doing what I assumed I was. I think rereading these prior to outreach and engagement and then starting a new project would be beneficial. So we're really pleased with how these have been going, and we're continuing to update them and improve them based on feedback from practitioners. Next. I also want to give a quick plug for some additional information that we're going to be adding based on feedback that we've received. So we've developed a glossary of key terms related to risk communication and social vulnerability, and we'll be pointing to other glossaries that also exist in this space. And then we're also working to develop a social vulnerability indices information page for people to dive a little bit deeper into some of those metrics. So stay tuned for those resources, and they'll be coming out soon. And I finally want to say, I think the why of this is really thinking about these populations who we know are disproportionately impacted when disasters happen, and putting them at the forefront of how we can engage and make sure that this engagement that we're doing is inclusive, whether it's doing a hazard mitigation plan or a risk communication activity. And so I really encourage you to check them out and use them in your specific context and provide feedback if you have it to us. And next slide. Finally, I just want to thank the Army Corps of Engineers who's made this work possible, and the National Science Foundation, and excited to answer your questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Carson, very much. And then Melissa, thank you for driving the slides so beautifully. If you could please share the next slide deck, we greatly appreciate it. And thank you, everyone. Please keep those questions and comments coming in the chat. We are really grateful. And Carson, just wanted to say that you've already gotten a really nice shout out from Eric as well as Gloria, really giving testimonials to how powerful and important and useful this work has already been done. So thank you so much, Carson, for your leadership. And Melissa, thank you for sharing those slides and getting those in full screen mode, which they are right now. And so I'm going to go ahead and lead off our last presentation, which is going to be focused on our ongoing research project analyzing state hazard mitigation plans with a lens toward social vulnerability and inclusive mitigation planning. Next slide, please. I am going to lead off this presentation, but then quickly I'm going to turn the reins over to Mary Painter, who is a postdoctoral research associate here at the Natural Hazard Center and who has been serving as the project lead for this research effort. And then we're going to turn it over to Melissa Villarreal, who is our graduate research assistant on this project. And we also want to acknowledge Dhruv Seth and Simran Chaudhary, who have been our 2 wonderful and wise undergraduate research assistants here at the University of Colorado Boulder. Next slide, please. So why state hazard mitigation plans and social vulnerability? And so first I want to say a little bit about the inspiration for this project, and then I'm going to turn to our 3 key applied research objectives. More than a decade ago, I read a master's thesis written by this wonderful student at Columbia University who had taken all the state hazard mitigation plans and analyzed them with a lens toward which states were and were not thinking about climate change in their state hazard mitigation planning process. And I read that thesis and I thought to myself, I would really love it if our team, our research team, could replicate that research, but with a lens towards social vulnerability, so we could understand how mitigation planning processes are or are not taking social vulnerability and socially vulnerable populations into account. Fast forward more than a decade, and that opportunity has now arisen with this wonderful team at hand. And so there are 3 key objectives to what it is that we are doing with this work. Number 1, we want to understand how social vulnerability, as well as related terms like social marginalization, are being conceptualized or not in the context of approved mitigation plans. Second, we want to understand which socially vulnerable populations are included or excluded in the approved plans. And this is because we now have 50 decades of research that show that a wide range of individuals and groups who exist at the social and economic margins of society may have a harder time preparing for, responding to, and recovering from disaster. So we wanted to understand which of those population groups are actually being acknowledged and written about in the plans. And then third, more recently, more and more social vulnerability indices, data sets, tools are available to help mitigation practitioners to spatially locate, to demographically characterize, or to otherwise understand socially vulnerable populations in their communities and states. And so we wanted to know, are those tools and indices being included in the plans? Next slide, please. So why now? Why are we doing this work now? In addition to receiving some generous support from an anonymous philanthropic donor that's allowed us to do this work, we also thought this was timely, and we confirmed this with our FEMA colleagues, that nearly 2/3 or 61% of state hazard mitigation plans were approved in 2018. Another quarter were approved in 2019. So a lot of these plans are coming up for renewal shortly. And so we wanted to do this research now to help inform the renewal process. In addition, as Kathleen so beautifully described, with this lens of trying to bring an equity lens to the revisions to the mitigation plans, we wanted to bring in a research lens to say, how is vulnerability and inequality being captured in the plans at present, and how might that influence a future equity lens? Next slide, please. And so what have we done so far? Mary Painter, with the project leadership here, dove right in when she joined the Natural Hazard Center, and she spent a couple of months building out a state hazard mitigation plan database that includes at present, all of the approved state hazard mitigation plans for all 50 states, for DC, for the 5 inhabited territories. And these plans range in length from 64 pages to more than 2,000 pages, and they average 649 pages. So you can see why we have a large and talented team of students who have joined us on this endeavor to help analyze all of those plans with a social vulnerability lens. Next slide, please. And so our key variables that we've analyzed so far is we've looked at everything from the title of the plan, when was the plan approved, who's the responsible state agency, what are the definitions of social vulnerability and related concepts that are or not included, what tools, indices, data sources are or are not drawn upon in the mitigation planning process. And then also we've been capturing qualitative data in terms of the conceptualization of key terms that we're interested in for this research. And we've also, as Mary's going to share in a moment, been quantitatively and qualitatively tracking which socially vulnerable populations are or are not named across these plans. And in turning this over to Mary, I just wanted to say, again, as Kathleen said at the beginning, there are thousands of local plans, hundreds of tribal plans that we have not even begun downloading and analyzing just yet, but this is our first pass and first effort to understand the characterization of social vulnerability. And so with that, over to you, Mary, for some of our key early findings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lori. That was an amazing primer to get started talking about some of these findings. So I wanted to talk for a minute of how social vulnerability is defined in state hazard mitigation plans at a very broad level. And thank you so much, Kathleen and Carson, for also giving definitions of social vulnerability. I know that sometimes can be a murky term, and I love that you guys define the terms for me. So thank you for doing that. So some states define social vulnerability from established definitions from institutions that measure social vulnerability. And the two main ones that they usually pull these from are the CDC, which has their own social vulnerability indice, or the Hazards and Vulnerability Research Institute, which is at the University of South Carolina, which also has its own social vulnerability indice. And as Kathleen alluded to earlier, there are these different measures for measuring social vulnerability on different scales. So the CDC SBI, for example, will be if you're closer to a 1, you're more vulnerable in that area. And if you're closer to a zero, you're less vulnerable in that area. And as we're thinking about state hazard mitigation plans and those grant fundings that Kathleen was talking about, these measures are important to include in state hazard mitigation plans because it helps identify more socially vulnerable either counties or census tracts, neighborhoods within a given state or area. Another thing I want to note about definitions of social vulnerability is that states use different terms to define social vulnerability across different plans. So some might say population vulnerability, vulnerable communities, but not necessarily use the term social vulnerability itself. And there's also some mixture of like how the term vulnerability just as a standalone is used. Can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so there's a frequency of the references to vulnerability across different state hazard mitigation plans. And from this specific graph, you can see the term vulnerability is there in almost all state hazard mitigation plans. Something to note about vulnerability is some of the state hazard mitigation plans use built environment vulnerability, structural vulnerability in the same way they use population vulnerability. So they use vulnerability to talk about both. It's interchangeable. That's the word I was looking for. They're interchangeable. Most use social vulnerability, and they use this term to mean these specific disadvantaged populations. And that definitely occurs in almost 2/3 of state hazard mitigation plans. A little less than half actually use a statistical measure like a social vulnerability index to identify or just discuss different disadvantaged populations within their state or territory. And some of these other key terms that we decided to look at, such as intersectionality, marginalization, oppression, things that we know from social, historical, political, and economic factors that make populations more socially vulnerable. These are used much less in state hazard mitigation plans, actually fairly rarely. Next slide, please. And just as an example, we have social vulnerability in Colorado. They use social vulnerability indicators, which are mostly pulled from census, and this is where social vulnerability indices get their indicators as well. And when I say indicators, I just mean types of populations. That's a fancy statistical term. And so for Colorado, they really focused on age-based measures of populations for vulnerability, special needs, so things like mobile homes and group quarters. So if we think about like crowding, ethnicity, race, class, poverty, wealth. So these demographic and socioeconomic variables to like understand the population. And just wanted to point out that they pull a social vulnerability definition from Weiser et al. In 2004, which is one of the more common used both academically and in practice for social vulnerability in their state hazard mitigation plan. So this is just an example of a state and how they define social vulnerability and the type of populations they're looking for in both a statistical sense and a qualitative sense in their discussion. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a lot, and I'm sorry, but we looked at a lot of different types of populations and state hazard mitigation plans. But I just want to give a brief overview and point out some specific statistics here so we can compare. So the first one I want to point out and highlight, if you could do the highlighting for me, Melissa, thank you, is these top categories, the ones that are really mentioned most. And these tend to be age-based populations. So things like elderly is the most with at 98%. So almost every single one mentions elderly populations as being vulnerable. And then second to that is children and disabled persons or people that have medical issues. So almost every state hazard mitigation plan looks at these specific populations. Everything else kind of runs the gambit lower than that. I also want to highlight a few here. One is that minority population, housing, and this specific housing, we're talking about people who rent, so renters, and populations, transportation access issues, those that can't have access to a car or public transportation, are much lower. They run about 20% of state hazard mitigation plans. And so in looking at this, another broad overview thing I would like to point out is that it's mixed, right? So like some state hazard mitigation plans might look at refugees, women's, and substance dependent populations, while another looks at unemployment, unhoused, and ethnic minorities. It's really such a wide variation among states. I also want to mention that this doesn't capture magnitude. So there might be a state hazard mitigation plan that looks at unhoused populations and maybe only a few others, but they talk a lot about unhoused populations. They work with community groups, and it's really their focus of their state hazard mitigation plan. So these specific measures aren't really captured in this specific statistic, but hopefully that's some future research we have in the future. Next slide. And so I just want to wrap up by having some couple takeaways. So as state and territories begin to think through their plans, updating their plans, and these findings can be useful to think about all of the social vulnerable populations and vulnerable populations that they can include in their plans. So maybe it's a population that the state hazard mitigation officer or those who's tasked with updating the plan haven't thought of these populations or had the opportunity to incorporate these populations into their plans. And so it can even provide some inspiration from state to state on who can be included. And it's also, like, as I mentioned before, that not every state or territory includes the same socially vulnerable population. So now, though, there's a lot of tools and indices that states can use. The climate and economic justice screening tool is also a great tool that states can use now to identify local smaller populations at the county or the census tract level to maybe make specific plans and equitable considerations for different populations within their state. So I think that's it for me. Is it over to you, Melissa?
Yeah, so I will take a quick minute to just highlight some of our next steps with this project. Thank you, Mary and Lori, for really summarizing this project and the importance of it. And so we are going to be presenting our findings at the 48th Annual Natural Hazards Workshop this summer in Broomfield, Colorado, during the poster session. So here is the link. We'll post it in the chat. So please join us if you're coming along, come and find us and we can chat more about our project. We are also publishing our data set and metadata on design safe infrastructure to really make this more accessible for those that can learn from this data and help improve mitigation plans moving forward and their inclusion of vulnerable populations. We are also working on developing and publishing an academic article of findings. And very excited about this part. We are also expanding the project to include a new study on how state hazard mitigation officers, as well as their partners and contractors, develop state hazard mitigation plans. So what resources do they have access to or not have access to? What resources do they need to actually develop and implement these plans? And how do those resources hinder or help with the inclusion of socially vulnerable populations within those plans? And so just thank all of you for being here, and I wanted to acknowledge also some of our funders and folks that have really helped us with this project and actually doing it. And so thank all of you. I look forward to your questions, comments, and everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, so much. And now we're going to use our remaining few minutes. Kathleen, you've received a number of excellent questions in the chat. So we're going to defer our time to you, and Carson, Mary, and Melissa. Thank you for your presentations. And Kathleen, thank you for leading us off so beautifully. So let's start off with Margaret. I had a question for you, Kathleen, about it was really interesting showing how many of the hazard mitigation plans are expired. Is there a common thread among the counties or localities that have let those plans expire? And I'll add anything that can be done about that.
Well, I don't know of a common thread. We haven't researched that and sometimes these things are, region to region, a lot of anecdotal information. But there are a few, I could theorize in a few areas. If I think COVID-19 and just the impacts of that have had some effects on communities kind of still trying to catch up. COVID-19 did lead to a lot of staff turnover. So again, anecdotal, I hear a lot from the regions and what the struggles are. And frequently it's staff turnover. And I think just local and state government I heard a story about North Carolina recently, like it's just hard to find people and compete. So that's one theory. It could be funding. It could be, there are a number of reasons. Sometimes certain jurisdictions join other jurisdictions to do their plans, and that will reflect in our database as expired. And this particular map doesn't necessarily show all the plans that there may be several of these expired plans that are also in process. So in other words, they're expired for a little bit, but they're working on their next version. So that timing is important. We try to emphasize how important it is to try to, apply for your grants early and finish your plan as soon as possible so you don't hit that expiration date. But we don't actually have it be always a good, interesting research with this great data that I was just seeing. So.
Kathleen, I was just thinking that I hope there's a motivated master's or doctoral student out there, because I think that question would be a great thesis. So thank you for that. We're going to give you another question from Francesca. Francesca wanted to know, Kathleen, is there any projected data on how effective these newer implementations, so these changes FEMA's put in place, how effective might they be compared to older policies?
We're not always, we have a lot of data people. We're not always the best at the advanced projections. I think we're moving that direction more and more. But what I would say is, as you noted, Lori, that we have a big tranche of state plans that are going to be updated this year and next year. And look at that wonderful data you have. So maybe, I think we should look at it and see, did this make a difference? And that was fascinating to see the different ways states approach social vulnerability, historically underserved communities. We don't have prescriptive requirements. We can't tell every state exactly how to do it. So back to that word, I heard somebody say inspiration and more training and more guidance and tools. So I hope we can track that in the next 5 years.
Thank you. I hope so too, Kathleen. In 1 minute, and then I'll do 1 minute of closeout. We had a great question from one of our colleagues from India who is here. And so I'm just going to ask generally, Kathleen, you shared so many great resources during your presentation, video recordings, written guidance. And I think this question is sort of, what if can they get sort of hands-on, hand-holding guidance either in the US or even internationally if people want to learn from FEMA, from our mitigation experts there at FEMA? What other guidance do you have available, or is it sort of go to the websites that you shared? Is that the best answer?
Well, that's certainly the quickest answer. I know that I used to work in the earthquake program many years ago at FEMA, and we had visitors coming from all over the world to kind of meet with us. But what I would say is I put a link in the chat to FEMA International Affairs. And I would suggest emailing them and asking them what opportunities are there for training, partnerships, et cetera. And I'll certainly keep my ears open, but I would start there.
Nice. Thank you, Kathleen. And again, thank you, Mary, Melissa, Carson, for the presentations. Thank you to FEMA for the support that makes this happen. And in our last few seconds, just a reminder, if you are here and wanting to receive the credit from IAEM, please make sure you reach out to us at hasctr@colorado.edu to get that certificate emailed to you. And Katie will drop that in the chat again. Also, just a reminder, please visit our hazards.colorado.edu website and subscribe for updates. So you can get updates on our future webinars with FEMA and also on our upcoming workshop and other resources that we offer through the center. Please save the date for May 16th, 2023. We are going to be hearing from an extraordinary group right here in Colorado about their Planning for Hazards guide and reducing community risk. So really excited about that and excited to see all of you back here then. And so with that, thank you to all the presenters. Thank you for joining us today, to all of the audience members. And thank you to Katie Murphy for everything you're doing behind the scenes to make this webinar series possible. Everyone, please take care of yourself and others, and we'll see you in May. Bye. Take care. Thank you.